December 7, 1941. 7:55 Uhr morgens. The Pacific sun climbed over Pearl Harbor, casting long shadows across the steel deck of the USS West Virginia. Below, in the mess hall, 22-year-old Doris Miller wiped down tables and collected laundry baskets. Breakfast service had ended 30 minutes earlier. The battleship rocked gently in the calm water, tethered to Ford Island alongside 6 other Titans of America's Pacific Fleet. Miller, a mess attendant second class, moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. In the segregated Navy of 1941, this was one of the few jobs available to men who looked like him. He'd boxed his way to ship's heavyweight champion, but his uniform bore no stripes of advancement. His hands, strong enough to drop opponents in the ring, now folded white tablecloths and stacked ceramic plates. The hum of Sunday morning filled the air. Men played cards. Officers read newspapers. Somewhere above, the American flag snapped in the breeze. Then the sky tore open. The first torpedo struck West Virginia's port side at 7:57 a.m., and everything Doris Miller thought he knew about his place in this war was about to change forever. To understand what happened on the deck of the USS West Virginia that morning, you must first understand the America that Doris Miller came from. Born in Waco, Texas in October 1919, Miller grew up in a nation where the color of his skin determined where he could eat, sleep, work, and die. The United States military, that supposed crucible of American democracy, was no different. It was completely segregated. Black men could serve their country, but only in positions white commanders deemed appropriate. The Navy restricted them almost entirely to mess attendant roles: cooks, stewards, servants. They cleaned officers' quarters. They served meals. They polished brass and scrubbed decks. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. The logic, if you could call it that, was simple and brutal. Black men were considered unfit for combat, untrustworthy with weapons, incapable of leadership, too unintelligent to follow complex orders. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had been clear about his position. Even as war clouds gathered over the Pacific, the idea of armed black sailors in combat roles remained unthinkable to white military leadership. Miller had enlisted in September 1938, seeking opportunity beyond the cotton fields and limited prospects of segregated Texas. The Navy promised adventure, training, a paycheck. What it delivered was a different kind of ceiling. No matter how capable, no matter how brave, no matter how dedicated, black sailors hit a wall the moment they stepped aboard. Mess attendant second class. That was the rank Miller held on December 7, 1941. That was as high as the Navy would let him climb. But something was shifting in black America, even as Miller folded laundry that Sunday morning. 2 months earlier, a young black soldier named James G. Thompson had written a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's most influential black newspapers. Thompson's words cut to the heart of a painful contradiction. "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" he asked. "Is the kind of America I know worth defending?" The Courier's response launched the Double V campaign in early 1942, victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. 2 battles. 2 fronts. The same war. Black Americans understood something that would take the rest of the nation years to acknowledge. You cannot fight for democracy overseas while denying it at home. You cannot claim moral superiority over Nazi racial theories while enforcing Jim Crow segregation in your own ranks. You cannot ask men to die for freedom they themselves do not possess. 1.2 million black Americans would serve in World War II. They would fight on 2 fronts simultaneously, against Axis tyranny in Europe and the Pacific, and against the racism embedded in their own military structure. They would be relegated to service units, supply battalions, and labor details. They would build the roads that white soldiers marched on. They would unload the ammunition that white soldiers fired. They would dig the graves that held soldiers of all colors. And when finally given the chance to fight, they would prove every racist assumption wrong. But on that December morning in Pearl Harbor, most of that still lay ahead. What mattered in that moment was simpler and more immediate. Japanese aircraft were screaming out of the sky, torpedoes were tearing through American steel, and Doris Miller was about to become something the Navy said he could never be. Pearl Harbor sat like a jewel in the Pacific, the crown of America's naval power in the Western Ocean. 8 battleships. Nearly 100 other vessels. Hundreds of aircraft lined up at nearby airfields. It represented the single greatest concentration of American military might outside the continental United States. To Japan's military planners, it represented the only obstacle standing between their empire and complete domination of the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had designed the attack with surgical precision. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had steamed across 3,400 miles of open ocean in complete radio silence. They launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. The first wave, departing at 6 a.m., included 183 planes: fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and high-altitude bombers. Their target coordinates had been memorized. Their objectives were clear: destroy the American Pacific Fleet before it could respond. The Japanese pilots expected chaos. They expected resistance. What they didn't expect was that the most effective defensive fire that morning would come from a mess attendant who'd never been trained to fire the weapons he was about to use. Aboard the USS West Virginia, the morning of December 7th had begun like any other Sunday. Captain Mervyn Benyon, a respected officer with 26 years of service, had reviewed the day's schedule. Services would be held at 0900 hours. Some crew had shore leave. Others attended to routine maintenance. The ship's band had practiced for an inspection scheduled for later that week. Miller had woken at 6 a.m. and served breakfast to the officers. By 7:30 he was in the junior officers section, collecting soiled laundry. It was mundane work, repetitive work, the kind of work the Navy believed was all black sailors were capable of performing. The West Virginia was moored at Battleship Row alongside Ford Island, outboard of the USS Tennessee. She was a Colorado-class battleship, 624 feet of armored steel displacing over 32,000 tons. Her main battery consisted of 8 16-inch guns. Her secondary armament included 12 5-inch guns and 8.50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns mounted around the superstructure. Those .50 caliber Browning machine guns were crew-served weapons, typically operated by trained gunners. They fired 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Effective range, nearly a mile. They were designed to track fast-moving aircraft and fill the sky with enough lead to bring them down. Miller had never fired one. He'd received no gunnery training. As a mess attendant he wasn't supposed to. At 7:55 a.m., the general alarm shattered the morning calm. Torpedoes were already in the water, launched from Nakajima B-5 and Kate bombers that had descended to wavetop height. The first one slammed into West Virginia's port side, below the waterline, tearing a hole 16 feet across. Then came the second, the third, the fourth. Within minutes, 6 torpedoes and 2 armor-piercing bombs would strike the battleship. Oil ignited on the water's surface. Smoke billowed from ruptured fuel tanks. Men screamed. Metal groaned. And somewhere in that chaos, Doris Miller dropped his laundry basket and ran toward the sound of battle. The Navy had told him his place. He was about to define it for himself. Every black sailor in Pearl Harbor that morning carried a double burden. They wore the same uniform as white sailors, but they didn't share the same rights. They slept in segregated quarters. They ate at separate tables. They were addressed differently, treated differently, valued differently. When Doris Miller enlisted in 1938, he'd signed up to defend a nation that wouldn't let him vote in much of the South. A nation where he couldn't drink from the same water fountain as his white shipmates. A nation where, even in uniform, he might be lynched if he walked through the wrong southern town at the wrong time. The military reflected the civilian world it came from. White officers commanded black enlisted men but rarely respected them. Stories circulated of black soldiers in training camps being beaten by white MPs. Of being denied access to base facilities that German prisoners of war could use freely. Of being called every racial slur imaginable while wearing the uniform of the United States Armed Forces. Miller knew this reality intimately. He was strong enough to be the ship's boxing champion, but the Navy wouldn't let him man the guns. He was smart enough to maintain complex machinery, but his rating kept him in the mess hall. His potential was irrelevant. His color decided everything. And yet, when the bombs started falling, Miller ran toward danger, not away from it. That choice speaks to something the military establishment couldn't measure. Courage has no color. The Japanese attack achieved near-perfect surprise. American radar operators had detected incoming aircraft at 7:02 a.m. but were told to disregard the reading, probably just B-17s arriving from the mainland. No one raised the alarm until the first bombs fell. Pearl Harbor's defenses were unprepared for Sunday morning warfare. Ammunition lockers were locked. Many anti-aircraft guns weren't manned. Officers were at breakfast or ashore. The fighter aircraft at nearby Wheeler and Hickam fields sat wingtip to wingtip, arranged for easy inspection rather than rapid deployment, perfect targets for Japanese strafers. The attackers came in low and fast. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water at less than 50 feet, launching their payloads at Battleship Row. Dive bombers screamed down from altitude, releasing armor-piercing bombs converted from naval shells. Fighters strafed anything that moved. West Virginia, moored outboard, absorbed the worst of it. The ship's position made her an easy target for torpedo runs. Within 10 minutes she'd taken 6 torpedoes to her port side, more than any other battleship that morning. Water flooded through massive hull breaches. The ship listed heavily to port, in danger of capsizing like the USS Oklahoma beside her. Counterflooding saved West Virginia from rolling over, but it couldn't save the men trapped below decks or stop the fires spreading through her superstructure. The ship was dying. And every sailor still alive faced a choice: abandon ship or fight back with whatever weapons they could reach. The Mitsubishi A6M0 dominated the Pacific skies in late 1941. Fast, maneuverable, with exceptional range, it could outfly most American fighters. Japanese pilots trained extensively, many with combat experience from China. They flew with confidence bordering on arrogance. Against them, American defenders scrambled to man weapons designed for sustained combat, not surprise attack. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun was a proven weapon, reliable, powerful, deadly at range. But it required training to operate effectively. Gunners needed to understand lead angles, deflection shooting, ammunition management. They needed to track fast-moving targets while under fire themselves. The gun weighed 84 pounds. It fired from a 200-round ammunition box. The recoil was substantial. Tracer rounds every fifth cartridge helped gunners adjust their aim. But in the chaos of battle, with smoke obscuring vision and explosions rocking the deck, accuracy became more instinct than calculation. No one had trained Doris Miller to fire this weapon. Yet in minutes he would have to master it or die trying. When the attack began, USS West Virginia's command structure disintegrated in seconds. Captain Benyon rushed to his battle station on the navigation bridge. Within minutes, shrapnel from a bomb explosion tore through his abdomen, a mortal wound. Executive officers scrambled to coordinate damage control as torpedoes ripped through the hull. Communications failed. Orders couldn't reach men below decks. In that vacuum, junior officers and enlisted men made their own decisions. Some fought fires. Others helped wounded shipmates. A few ran to unmanned gun positions, abandoning their assigned duties to do what needed doing. This was where institutional racism collided with battlefield reality. The Navy's rigid hierarchy had placed Miller and other black sailors in positions of servitude, assuming they'd never need to fight. But when officers fell wounded and gun stations stood empty, those assumptions became meaningless. Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, one of the few officers still mobile, ordered Miller to help carry the mortally wounded Captain Benyon to safety. Miller, with another sailor, lifted the captain through smoke and fire, moving him to a more protected position. But Benyon couldn't be saved. He would die at his post, awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Ricketts then pointed Miller toward an unmanned anti-aircraft gun. No time for training. No time for questions. Just a simple directive: fire at anything with a red circle on its wings. The Navy said black men couldn't handle combat responsibility. The Navy said they lacked the intelligence and composure. In that moment, none of that mattered. There was a gun. There were enemy aircraft. And there was a man willing to fight. Japanese pilots that morning expected resistance, but not from this quarter. Their intelligence had been thorough. Ship positions, defensive capabilities, likely response times. They'd studied American tactics, American equipment, American weaknesses. What they hadn't studied was American resolve at the individual level. They'd convinced themselves that a decisive first strike would shatter American will. That catching the fleet at anchor would eliminate any meaningful defense. Some Japanese aviators later expressed shock at how fiercely Americans fought back despite the surprise. Pilots expected easy runs, minimal anti-aircraft fire. Instead, they encountered withering defensive barrages from men who refused to surrender, refused to flee, refused to accept defeat. To the Japanese pilots diving on Battleship Row, the race of the men firing back was irrelevant. What mattered was the tracers arcing toward their cockpits. What mattered was the sudden realization that Americans were fighting harder than expected. What mattered was that planes were being hit, damaged, shot down. The fundamental irony of World War II crystallized in moments like these. America fought against Nazi racial ideology while enforcing its own racial hierarchy. The nation condemned Hitler's persecution of Jews while lynching black citizens with impunity. The military championed freedom while segregating its ranks. Black soldiers and sailors understood this contradiction viscerally. They weren't naive about American democracy. They knew its promises remained unfulfilled. They knew that German prisoners of war often received better treatment in southern states than black servicemen in uniform. And yet they fought. Not because America had earned their loyalty, but because they understood that defeating fascism abroad might create space to defeat racism at home. The Double V campaign wasn't just a slogan, it was a strategy. Prove your worth in battle. Demonstrate your courage under fire. Make it impossible for America to deny your full citizenship. Doris Miller's actions that morning would become ammunition in that larger fight. Not because he sought glory but because he did what needed doing when it needed doing. The Navy could ignore that lesson but it couldn't erase it. Doris Miller reached the gun platform through a hell of smoke and fire. The .50 caliber Browning M2 sat unmanned, its twin barrels pointed skyward. Around him, the deck of the USS West Virginia burned. Oil fires spread across the water. Sailors screamed for help. The ship listed 12 degrees to port, groaning under the weight of seawater flooding compartments below. Miller grabbed the gun's handles. He'd never fired it before. Never trained on it. Never even touched one outside of watching the designated gunners during drills. But the mechanism was simpler than the Navy's bureaucracy. A trigger, a sight, ammunition belts feeding from both sides. Another wave of aircraft roared overhead. Oh. Close enough to see the pilots' faces. Close enough to see the red circle insignia, the rising sun painted on their wings and fuselages. Miller squeezed the trigger. The gun erupted. The recoil shuddered through his shoulders, his chest, his entire body. Brass casings ejected in a golden stream, clattering against the deck. Tracers arced into the sky, every fifth round glowing red-hot, showing him where his bullets went. Too low. He adjusted. Squeezed again. The gun's rhythm became his rhythm. Short bursts. Track the target. Lead the aircraft. Squeeze. Adjust. Squeeze again. A Zero fighter dove toward the Arizona, preparing to strafe her deck. Miller swung the gun, following the aircraft's path. He fired a sustained burst. Tracers converged on the fighter's fuselage. Sparks erupted along its wing. The Zero wobbled, trailing smoke, peeling away from its attack run. He didn't celebrate. There were more coming. The sky was full of them. Japanese aircraft swarmed Battleship Row like hornets, diving and climbing, bombing and strafing. Columns of smoke rose from burning ships. The Arizona exploded at 8:06 a.m., her forward magazine detonating with such force that the shockwave knocked men off their feet across the harbor. Miller kept firing. The gun barrel grew hot. The ammunition belts fed round after round. His hands blistered from the heat of the metal, but he didn't let go. Every burst sent hundreds of rounds into the sky. Some missed. Some connected. Tracers interlaced with streams of fire from other ships, creating a deadly web above the harbor. A Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, having dropped its payload, circled back to strafe survivors in the water. Miller tracked it, let it, fired. The bomber's engine coughed black smoke. It lost altitude rapidly, clipping the water surface before cartwheeling into the harbor in a spray of white foam and twisted metal. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. The gun's thunder drowned out everything else. The world narrowed to targets, tracers, triggers. Diba bombes da sanda. Fighters circled. Miller fired at all of them. Beside him, Lieutenant Ricketts coordinated what remained of the ship's defense. Other sailors manned other guns. But West Virginia was mortally wounded. 6 torpedoes had torn her port side open. 2 bombs had penetrated her armored deck. Fires raged on multiple levels. Water rose and flooded compartments. Miller fired until the ammunition ran out. When the last round left the chamber, when the gun fell silent, his hands trembled from exhaustion. His ears rang. His shoulders ached. Smoke stung his eyes. But he was still standing. Still fighting. Still refusing to accept what the Navy had told him about his place in this war. The second wave arrived at 8:40 a.m., 54 high-altitude bombers, 78 dive bombers, 36 fighters. They found Pearl Harbor already ablaze, ships sinking, the sky filled with smoke and defensive fire. But they pressed their attacks anyway. Miller had no more ammunition for the anti-aircraft gun. Lieutenant Ricketts ordered him to help evacuate wounded men. The ship was settling deeper into the harbor, sinking by the bow. Oil fires spread across the water's surface, turning the harbor into a burning maze. Miller descended into the smoke-filled passageways. Sailors stumbled through darkness, disoriented, choking on fumes. Some had burns covering half their bodies. Others had broken limbs from explosions. Many were trapped below decks as water rose and sealed compartments. He pulled men through oily water. Carried them up ladders. guided them through twisted metal and fire to relative safety. His uniform, soaked with seawater and fuel, clung to his skin. His hands, already blistered from the gun, bled from handling hot metal. He kept moving. The West Virginia listed 16 degrees now. Too far. Much further and she'd capsize like the Oklahoma, which had already rolled over, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. Counter-flooding operations fought desperately to keep West Virginia upright. Sailors opened valves to flood starboard compartments deliberately, balancing the weight of water pouring through the portside torpedo holes. Miller helped carry wounded sailors across the deck to the quarterdeck where they could be transferred to rescue boats. Each trip took him through fire and smoke. Each trip risked his life for men who, in some cases, wouldn't have shared a meal with him back in the States. At 8:54 a.m. the second wave's attacks began to taper. Japanese aircraft, running low on fuel and ammunition, formed up and headed back to their carriers. The all-clear wouldn't sound until 9:45 a.m., but the worst of the attack was over. West Virginia burned but didn't sink completely. She settled onto the harbor floor, her superstructure still above water. Of her crew of 1,541 men, 106 died in the attack. Another 52 were wounded. Captain Benyon died on the bridge. 2 brothers, compartment repair men, drowned below decks when they remained at their posts to secure watertight doors, trapping themselves to save others. Miller climbed down from the dying ship in the late morning. His clothes were black with oil. His face was streaked with soot and blood, none of it his. He'd fired an anti-aircraft gun until it ran dry. Officially, Navy records would credit him with shooting down at least 1 Japanese aircraft. Miller himself, when asked later, said quietly, "I think I got one of those Jap planes. They were diving pretty close to us." Witnesses said he shot down more. Some reported 4 planes. Others said 6. The chaos of battle made exact counts impossible. Aircraft fell to combined fire from multiple ships. Smoke obscured observation. But one fact remained undeniable. A black mess attendant with no gunnery training had manned a weapon he wasn't supposed to touch and had defended his ship as fiercely as any trained gunner. The Navy had told him what he couldn't do. Doris Miller had just shown them what he could. Across Pearl Harbor, the devastation was total. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. 3 cruisers hit. 3 destroyers destroyed. 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans dead. 1,178 wounded. But America hadn't been knocked out of the war. It had been awakened. And among those who fought back against impossible odds on that December morning, a mess attendant from Texas had proven that courage and competence had nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. The question now was whether America would learn that lesson, or whether Miller's heroism would be forgotten in a nation still committed to segregation. 4 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller's name remained unknown. The Navy released no details about his actions. Official reports mentioned an unnamed Negro messman, who had manned a machine gun and fired at Japanese planes. Nothing more. No name. No recognition. Just another anonymous sailor who'd done his duty. But the black press refused to let the story die. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, newspapers that reached hundreds of thousands of black readers, demanded answers. Who was this sailor? Why wasn't he being recognized? Why was his heroism buried in generic references while white sailors received immediate commendations and name recognition? The NAACP launched a campaign. Letters poured into the Navy Department. Black civic organizations pressured military officials. Finally, in March 1942, 3 months after the attack, the Navy revealed his identity. Doris Miller. Mess Attendant 2nd Class. USS West Virginia. The revelation sparked something powerful in Black America. Here was proof, undeniable documented proof, that black servicemen could fight with courage and skill when given the chance. Miller became a symbol overnight, not just of individual heroism but of collective potential denied by systematic racism. The Double V campaign seized on Miller's story. Victory abroad, victory at home. His actions demonstrated what black Americans had been arguing for years. Give us the opportunity and we'll prove our worth. Stop judging us by color and start judging us by character and capability. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally pinned the Navy Cross on Miller's chest. It was the first time a black sailor had received the Navy's 3rd highest decoration for valor. The ceremony took place aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, with newsreel cameras recording every moment. Miller stood at attention in his crisp white uniform, the Navy Cross gleaming on his chest. Nimitz spoke of courage under fire, of devotion to duty, of heroism that inspired all Americans. The words were genuine. But they also carried weight the admiral might not have fully understood. This was vindication for an entire community told they weren't capable of this kind of valor. Black newspapers printed Miller's photograph on front pages across the nation. He was featured on recruiting posters. Above and beyond the call of duty, the posters proclaimed, showing Miller in his dress uniform, encouraging other black men to enlist. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Navy was using Miller to recruit black sailors while still restricting them to mess attendant positions. Miller's celebrity grew. He toured the country promoting war bonds, speaking at rallies, meeting with civic leaders. Everywhere he went, black communities turned out by the thousands. He represented hope, proof that heroism transcended the artificial boundaries white society had constructed. But recognition didn't mean change, not yet. Miller received a promotion to cook third class. Still not a combat rating. Still not what his actions had earned. The Navy gave him a medal but wouldn't give him a gun. They praised his courage but wouldn't let him serve as a gunner. Back in training, Miller found himself teaching others, ironically, about damage control and combat readiness. The Navy wanted his image, his story, his symbolic value. But the institution itself remained resistant to fundamental reform. Segregation continued. Black sailors still faced discrimination daily. German prisoners of war still received better treatment in Southern training facilities than black servicemen in uniform. Yet Miller's story rippled outward. It emboldened other black sailors. It gave ammunition to civil rights leaders arguing for integration. It forced uncomfortable conversations in Navy halls and congressional chambers. How could the military justify denying combat roles to men who'd proven themselves under fire? The answer, of course, was that it couldn't. Not logically. Not morally. But institutional racism doesn't require logic. It sustains itself through inertia, through traditions, through the simple refusal to change until change becomes unavoidable. Miller's story was powerful, but it wasn't singular. Across every theater of World War II, black servicemen were proving the same point, fighting the same two-front war. The Tuskegee Airmen flew over 15,000 sorties in Europe, escorting bombers deep into German territory. Bomber crews requested them specifically, the Red Tails, with their distinctive painted aircraft. They shot down over 100 enemy aircraft and never lost a bomber under their escort. The military establishment had said black men couldn't fly complex aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen made that lie impossible to sustain. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, fought for 183 consecutive days in Europe under General Patton's Third Army. They helped liberate concentration camps. They captured 30 major towns across France, Belgium, and Germany. Patton, despite his personal prejudices, acknowledged their combat effectiveness. The 92nd Infantry Division fought in Italy. The 93rd fought in the Pacific. The Red Ball Express, mostly black truck drivers, kept Allied armies supplied during the drive across France, moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily through dangerous territory. And in less celebrated roles, hundreds of thousands more served in engineering battalions, anti-aircraft units, port operations, and medical corps. They built the infrastructure of victory. They unloaded the ships. They maintained the equipment. Without them, the American war machine would have ground to a halt. The Navy listed him as presumed dead. He'd survived Pearl Harbor, survived the initial onslaught that launched America into war, only to die 2 years later in a lesser-known battle. His death received far less attention than his heroism. The newspapers that had celebrated him ran brief obituaries. Then the war moved on as wars do, consuming men and attention with equal appetite. But Miller's legacy lived on. His actions at Pearl Harbor became part of the argument that finally forced change. On July 26, 1948, 5 years after Miller's death, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the United States Armed Forces. The process would take years to fully implement, but the principle was established. Segregation in the military was over. It happened because thousands of black servicemen had fought and died proving it should happen. Because the Tuskegee Airmen made segregation untenable. Because the 761st Tank Battalion demonstrated combat excellence. Because men like Doris Miller had manned guns they weren't supposed to touch and shot down planes they weren't supposed to be able to hit. They fought for a country that didn't fully accept them. They wore uniforms that didn't guarantee them respect. They defended freedoms they themselves were denied. And in doing so they changed the nation they served. There's a photograph of Doris Miller receiving the Navy Cross. He stands at attention, shoulders back, eyes forward. The metal gleams against his white uniform. His expression is serious, almost solemn. He doesn't smile for the cameras. Perhaps he understood something the rest of America was still learning. Medals don't erase contradictions. Recognition doesn't equal justice. Individual heroism, no matter how extraordinary, cannot substitute for systemic change. Miller's story forces us to reckon with uncomfortable truths about American history. He defended a nation that wouldn't defend him. He fought for freedoms he was denied. He proved his worth to a military that had already decided, before he ever fired a shot, that men like him weren't worthy. And yet he fought anyway. That's the complexity of the Double V campaign, the nuance that easy narratives miss. Black Americans in World War II didn't fight because they were naive about racism. They fought despite understanding it perfectly. They wagered that proving their courage in battle would make their demands for equality at home impossible to ignore. They were partially right. Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor, the Tuskegee Airmen's excellence in the skies over Europe, the 761st Tank Battalion's valor in France. These accomplishments chipped away at the foundation of segregation. They made racist assumptions harder to sustain. They gave civil rights leaders evidence to support what they'd always known. The only thing holding Black Americans back was America itself. But change came slowly, grudgingly, incompletely. Miller died 2 years after Pearl Harbor, still denied the combat rating his actions had earned. Integration of the military came in 1948, but integration of Southern schools required federal troops in 1957. The Civil Rights Act didn't pass until 1964. The struggle Miller represented continued long after his death. His story endures because it captures something essential about courage. Real courage, not the Hollywood version. Miller didn't seek glory. He didn't plan to be a hero. When chaos erupted, when the world burned, when every instinct said run, he ran toward the guns instead. He did what needed doing simply because it needed doing. The Japanese pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor that morning couldn't have known that one of their fiercest opponents would be a mess attendant the United States Navy considered unfit for combat. They couldn't have known that his actions would echo through history, contributing to changes that would reshape American society. But history remembers. The Navy named a frigate after him, the USS Miller, commissioned in 1973. In 2020, the Navy announced that a Ford-class aircraft carrier would bear his name, the USS Doris Miller, the first carrier named for a black sailor. These honors matter. But they matter most because of what Miller represents. The thousands of black servicemen who fought on two fronts simultaneously, who demanded their country live up to its ideals, who refused to accept that courage had a color. They fought for the America that could be, not the America that was. And in fighting they helped create it.